do, welcome again, and I will hand over to our first presenter from Brussels, Bruno.
Thank you, Suzanne. Technically, I'm in Utrecht, but I feel like I'm presenting from Brussels.
Let's just all imagine that you're in the midst of the neighborhood.
Yes. All right. Elizabeth Mariels, who I'm working together with for this in the work in Cureghem, cannot be here, but I will do my utmost best to represent her work today, which is titled New Beginnings, Making Provisional Livelihoods via Cureghem's Infrastructure. A quick look at the breakout session that we will chair, if you want. It focuses specifically on the neighborhood and on questions and explores the advantages and disadvantages of the neighborhood scale for developing arrival policies that could take into account the polycentricity of integrations, create possibilities for the co-construction of such policies by a range of local actors and people on the move themselves. And it could enable people to realize futures beyond the imagined and often monolithic national integration trajectories. So we're going to build towards these 3 points in the presentation, and they will come back at the end, and we will have time to discuss these more in depth and during the breakout session. The starting point for this discussion is based obviously on our fieldwork in Cureghem, which we are now beginning to process. Many of the people we met and talked to were busy with new beginnings for themselves, making use of the resources available in Cureghem and at the same time co-creating resources for others in Cureghem. These beginnings build on having a foot somehow in Cureghem. So for example, Mohamed, born in Tunisia, for example, left the train on the edge of Cureghem at the Brussels South station, coming from France after a long history of living and traveling through various places. But Solomon, on the other hand, initially born in Eritrea, had been living for a while already in Belgium as an asylum seeker, but was forced to leave the apartment in a municipality far from Brussels when he received his refugee status. And he eventually found a studio in Cureghem. New beginnings, however, might sound too strong, as it might also reflect perhaps our Cureghem centrist point of view, because after all, Cureghem is our starting point, but it is not necessarily the one of our interlocutors, right? So but the full stories of these persons, and we've collected much more than 2, obviously, reveal that there is also, from the perspective of our participants, something of a new beginning, at least, going on in Cureghem, but it's also much of a continuation. Now, our hesitation here has everything to do with the weight of terms such as newcomer in the Belgian context. Unlike in Germany or in the UK, in Belgium, the newcomer is actually an official policy category used, for example, to define who is obligated to follow a package of integration courses and who's not. What's more, within the Brussels capital region, there are currently 2 official newcomer policies, one organized by the Dutch-speaking integration services, one organized by the French-speaking integration services. And to make things even more complex, both services define the formal newcomer differently. So, approaching our research participants' practices as new beginnings, we hope to avoid falling into some of these subnational temporalities and categorizations in Belgium, and to observe rather, to see what, to observe what such states categorizations and do in practice. The new beginnings of our research participants narrate practices of assembling new provisional livelihoods. And we connect here to recent work of scholars like Susan Hall, but also Hannah Schilling, Talia Blokland, and Abdul Malik Simon, who move the concept of unstable and precarious livelihoods from its context as being studied in development studies in the global south to Western Europe. And we approach these livelihoods in terms of infrastructures as defined by, for example, Deborah Cohen, who writes, infrastructures are the collectively constructed systems that build and sustain human life. We build infrastructure and it builds us. So the practices we are interested in, the incremental assembling of provisional livelihoods that we're interested in, they occur within and manipulate the surrounding social material environment. Structure that is made up of parks and benches, train stations, informal private rental rooms, but also cafes, shops, and so on. And some of the livelihoods that we have been looking at unfold almost entirely on a very limited scale. And in the following vignette, chronicled by Elizabeth, you get an idea of how Mohammed, which we introduced earlier, begins from scratch to make a livelihood in a very limited perimeter around the Brussels South station, as a Tunisian man that he knew in Brussels never answers the phone. The day he arrived, Mohammed left Gare du Midi and walked in the direction of the city center along the parking lot on Avenue Fonceny. Then he asked un Arabo if he knew where he could sleep. The man referred him to a hotel managed by a Moroccan man on Boulevard Lemonnier above a cafe. Mohammed tells me he stayed there for 10 days and took only one shower, that it was too disgusting. 10 nights of his stay, but he says they never clean and everything is filthy. Sheets on the bed, the towels. It's after he stayed there, Mohammed tells me, that he starts working for Il Siriano. He met the Syrian man who was working in the street, and via the man he finds work and a house, since Il Siriano is padrone del lavoro e padrone della casa. The house is a place where 4 people can sleep. One other man staying there deals drugs. Mohammed tells me that he didn't want to stay there, that if the police would come, that he would not be able to make himself clear as he doesn't speak French, while the other does. He paid the rent, 200 euro, even though he didn't stay the full month, and he still carries the key of the house. From Il Siriano, Mohammed went to the Piccolo Giardino, the little garden on Square de l'Aviation, and slept there, where everybody pisses and poops. The next day at 7 o'clock in the morning, he saw 2 women sitting on the square and asked for a cigarette and a coffee. One of them brought him to Semi Social, a night shelter. And there, he says, I took the paper, I called many times, but never had a place, never. Then some other day, I arrived after work, dirty from the work, and I asked to have a place inside. There are so many drunk people who don't work, but have a place to sleep, and I don't. And so afterwards, he slept again on Square l'Aviation, where he will also approach me, meaning Elizabeth. Together with Mohammed, we start to see how he inhabits a part of the urban infrastructure in and around the Brussels South station. We cannot really say that he inhabits the neighborhoods as a kind of a totality. Rather, he finds his way to particular centers in the area where particular practices are possible and others not. So, indeed, as Jan Blommaert and colleagues argue, neighborhoods are polycentric. They consist of multiple centers with their own particular interactional regimes. In the train station, for example, Mohammed cannot sleep. The regime of the place does not allow to sleep there, but he does sleep and refresh himself on the Square de l'Aviation. And he can get food from an organization that collects leftovers from the snack bars in the train station. He can get water, coffee, clothes, and blankets from the Russians, which is the information center for Ukrainian refugees. He can charge his phone on the WeWhat bikes in the central hall. And as much as the neighborhoods, Mohammed's livelihood is, in that sense, polycentric, even when assembled at such a small scale. And he learns how to make use of, but also repurpose, a pre-existing and collectively constructed social material surrounding. But however, it is the continuous maintenance, the everyday hard work of repurposing his surroundings, stitching together such a livelihood, which makes it difficult to move on from the situation. The infrastructure at hand does not offer him much more than the basics of survival. He cannot actually rebuild himself, and he rather turns around in circles. And it's not a coincidence that a month after that first conversation, Mohammed wants to leave and start again in Liège, or if that doesn't work out, somewhere in Germany. But These polycentric livelihoods do not necessarily limit themselves to such small scales and neighborhoods. I meet Solomon, born in Eritrea, during a cooking session of the Dream Kitchen, a collective cooking activity organized by Cureghem that takes place Monday till Thursday underneath the large roof of the abattoir in Cureghem, and we communicate in a mix of English and Flemish. Solomon applied for asylum some years ago, lived for a while in a camp, as he calls it, where he learned Dutch, and was near the end of his procedure sent to a municipality in the Walloon part of Belgium. He could have a room in an apartment rented by the Municipal Center for Social Welfare, and from there he could continue his Dutch courses in the city of Tienen across the border in Flanders. The apartment was only a temporary solution, only extendable for a few months, and he had to search on his own for a private apartment, which he searched somewhere in Flanders. But the social welfare agency in Wallonia didn't really help with this, and a Syrian friend in his apartment gave him the contacts of a Turkish landlord who lets a room in Cureghem. So the first 6 months during the pandemic, Solomon felt locked in his studio in Cureghem. He didn't speak French. He couldn't proceed with anything because the municipal police had to pass by to check whether he really lived in the studio. And as long as his presence wasn't approved officially, he was still officially living in a municipality in Wallonia, without access to benefits in Brussels, without the right to start education, and most of all, without the possibility for family reunification. His social assistant at Bonn, which is the Flemish integration service in Brussels, points him eventually to Cureghem to find some distraction. And when I meet Solomon for the first time, his family has arrived, and he tells me that he searched for a Dutch-speaking kindergarten for his daughter, which he found in Uckel, a municipality at the outskirts of Brussels, which he can only reach with a 30-minute bus drive. There were places more nearby, but he was afraid that if she would go to a French kindergarten, he wouldn't be able to understand the teachers. Solomon tells me that he has difficulties finding work because of transport problems. An Eritrean friend of him works in Boom, which is near the city of Antwerp, in a packaging factory, where they start at 6 a.m. and he has no car. On top of that, his driving licenses for regular cars and for heavy transport are not recognized in Belgium, so he has to redo all that. He feels stuck in Brussels because formal and informal services in Brussels in Dutch, the services in Dutch are few and far between. And before his wife arrived and brought tons of teff flour, he regularly went to Antwerp by train to buy teff. Now, we have explored here the crucial role of Cureghem in providing essential building blocks for the stitching together of a variety of new provisional livelihoods, often as a result of the absence or insufficiency of the state. The neighborhood here emerges as a polycentric space. Some of these emerging but often very precarious livelihoods emerge on small and local scales, such as the one of Mohammed. But even then, they demonstrate that such stitching occurs in a polycentric social material surrounding. Other livelihoods, perhaps less precarious, but equally unstable and polycentric, only partially lean on the centers in Cureghem. As compared to Mohammed's, Solomon centers are much more spread across space. And although it's living in Cureghem, Solomon identifies an employment center in a packaging factory near Antwerp, an administrative center at the municipality in Wallonia, a school for kindergarten center in Uckel, a volunteering center. In our breakout group, we therefore would like to discuss with you the advantages of the neighborhood scale. For knowing all that, developing arrival policies that take into account these polycentricity of integrations that we see going on. Possibilities for the co-construction of such policies by local actors and people on the move, and possibilities for enabling people to realize futures beyond the imagined and often monolithic national integration trajectories. So thank you very much.